Welcome to our April 23rd episode of Right Now. I'm Chris Reddy in studio here at WILI 95.3 FM. I have with me producer Matt and our intern Anthony this afternoon joining us for this episode that I'm going to start off with something that is not political. Matt, Anthony, are you guys baseball fans by any chance?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, I grew up with baseball.
Excellent. Very good. One of my favorite rivalries of all time is the Yankees-Red Sox.
Of course.
And we're in the midst of that right now.
Yep.
But the reason I brought this up was that in watching some of the Yankees-Red Sox highlights and recaps today, I happened to see something that was pretty amazing that happened in the Mariners game. Did you happen to catch this?
No, I didn't. What happened?
So a Mariners pitcher gets a line drive right back up the middle at him. And because he's right-handed, kind of turning towards first base, the baseball slides between the buttons of his jersey and gets stuck in his shirt.
Oh, wow.
Like, what are the odds of that happening?
Yeah, I've never heard of that one.
Can you imagine what the ruling was? Is that an out, or do you think that's a hit?
Probably an out.
It was a hit.
Okay.
Believe it or not, ruling with baseball is that you have to have control either with your hand or the mitt. And in this case, where it went through the buttons of his jersey and got stuck with inside of his jersey, it was ruled a single.
Wow.
But it was just something that I had never, ever even considered. Never thought about it. Never even thought, like, this is something that we have to even consider.
That's funny.
Pretty crazy to see that happen there. So, fun little start to our show, completely unrelated to what we typically do here on Right Now. I want to give the quick reminder to everybody, if you don't have the opportunity to listen to our episodes live, also I have some updates today from previous episodes where we've discussed topics on Right Now. You can always tune into our broadcast in several other saved formats and on different media. You can go to WILI.com, you can go to podcasts, you can scroll down to Right Now, and you can listen to the podcast format of our previous episodes. You can also go to YouTube. You can search WILI and Right Now. You can pull up the in-studio video recordings that we record here while we're doing our show live. You can also now go to Spectrum Public Access Channel 192 on Tuesdays at 6:30 and Saturdays at 7 p.m., and you can see this week's episodes of Right Now. Couple things that we're going to start off with. Some of the state legislative updates that I want to provide everybody with some topics that we've talked about in the past few weeks. That's why it's so always important to tune in so that you stay informed and you can follow along with some of the previous information that I provided and some of the updates that you're going to get now. We're getting very close to the end of the 2026 legislative session. The final day is called Sine Die. It occurs May 6th. They have until midnight on May 6th to finish debating and deliberating bills that are being raised in Hartford this legislative session. We're within a couple of weeks. And in fact, one of the topics that we've discussed in several previous episodes of Right Now has to do with one of the bills that is being debated in the Senate today. This passed I want to say 2 days ago in the House of Representatives in Hartford, and this is House Bill 5044. This sets the vaccine standards for Connecticut. In fact, it's called an Act Establishing Connecticut Vaccine Standards, and it has to do with the religious freedoms that were federally regulated years ago. In fact, in 1993, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is what they are seeking to amend with House Bill 5044. What they're looking to do is create an exemption from religious freedoms to anyone who opposes vaccines that are required for school attendance in Connecticut. I want to take this back just a little bit so that we have some context associated with this. In my previous career as a paramedic, especially following 9/11, there was a lot of funding that was available for education in all related topics, including chemical and biological warfare, where we talked about vaccines and how you would treat something nefarious that happened. And in fact, When you look at the rate of vaccines in Connecticut, consistently we are among the highest in the country, vaccine rates that are in the mid to upper 90s. And right now it's estimated to be about 98.2% vaccine rates for children entering school systems. There are some issues with vaccines, especially people that have had prior reactions to vaccines and adverse reactions. Vaccine injuries are something that does happen. It was Ronald Reagan that I talked about months ago in a previous episode, who was the first one who set the standard when he was president that in order to sue a pharmaceutical company for any type of vaccine injury, you actually had to go through suing the federal government. And that has really caused not only a great difficulty for people to be successful in negotiating these type of cases, but also in being able to receive the awards that should sometimes be applied there. But anyways, the vaccine rate in Connecticut is extremely high. When you look at herd immunity, which is a term that's thrown around a lot with vaccine schedules, when you look at the actual numbers that are involved here, you're talking about herd immunity that really starts at about 80% vaccine rate. At that point, you have such a overwhelming majority of the population that has been vaccinated that you see a significant decrease in the transmission of any type of communicable disease or any type of disease that could be transmitted from one individual to another. We're significantly above that, and I think that to look at the freedoms that are being imposed upon when we try to go to some sort of a mandate that overrules the First Amendment, this is where we have to really look deeper into this. And this is something that I mentioned several weeks ago in a previous episode, and this had to do with our Attorney General in the state of Connecticut, who is currently facing a state lawsuit alleging violations of First Amendment rights related to religious exemptions for vaccines. But there are also two pending federal lawsuits that will be heard in 2026 at possibly the Supreme Court level. What the state has to prove in order to have the authority to remove First Amendment rights of religious freedoms is that there has to be a compelling government interest that warrants the removal of these First Amendment rights, for instance, a public emergency, and also that burden of proof also has to show that the government did this removal of First Amendment rights in the least restrictive manner possible. Those two are a large burden of proof to overcome. And because of that, you now have Senate Bill 5044 trying to establish a Connecticut vaccine standard. It did pass out of the House the other day in a vote of 86 to 61. It is in the Senate today being debated. But what I'm trying to get to here is that the goalposts are being changed for an outcome, and it's so that a legal standing and a precedent can be set so that the Attorney General in Connecticut has a better opportunity to win these pending lawsuits, because he is now changing the standards that are being set to align with his defense. So that's something that is very important. And as always, I've said this in previous episodes also, if you oppose any of the bills or even support some of the bills that we talk about on here, make sure you're letting your legislators know. Make sure that you're doing things such as filing written testimony with the Connecticut legislature. You can do that by going to the CGA website at cga.gov. You can also Google the committee. And in fact, right now you can go to simply appropriations for the state of Connecticut because all of the other committees have already conducted their voting. They voted bills out of the individual committees, and now everything is in appropriations. We only have a couple weeks left, so please, if you are in opposition to any of these bills that I talk about on this show, make sure that your voice is heard. That's very important here. So this is something that's happening right now. I will provide an update on Monday. We will be back with also another sister show of mine, and kind of spin-off that Mike DeSonier has started on Mondays, Unfiltered, from the 3 to 4 p.m. slot. I'll be in on Monday to give you a little bit of an update there. But there's a couple of other things that I want to update you on as information as we're working through our first segment here. Another episode that I actually think I spent portion of 2 different episodes of this show talking about Public Act 490 and the land use assessment values that were a shock at the beginning of this year to farms across the state of Connecticut who fell under a land use assessment value for their property taxes that was based on the current use of the farm. There was some of the real big concerns was there was dramatic increases in certain described tillable types of land and wetlands that were on these PA 490 designated farm properties. And you had a result of a doubling or tripling of property taxes within 1 year that some of these farms faced. Well, while we were talking about that, one of my guests was William Della Camera, and he has been a big advocate for farms across Connecticut. And one of the things that we discussed in the prior episode where he was a guest was a federal block grant funding that was supposed to provide relief for Connecticut farmers that sustained damage, crop damage specifically, by weather all the way back to 2023 and 2024. On last Thursday, a week ago, the Ag Secretary, Brooke Rollins, said in a House Appropriations Subcommittee hearing that this block grant funding of $53 million that was going to go to Connecticut farmers is at the finish line. So that is good news for some of the prior guests on Right Now who did suffer damages as farmers, and hopefully this is something that will provide them with the necessary relief that they require in order to continue farming and providing us with a good source of local, organic, and healthy foods. In following up on this, I happened to come across a couple of articles that I read that I want to provide you a little bit of further information on. And it's completely related to what we had talked about in these prior episodes. What I'm going to describe right now, I want to make sure that I'm very clear on a definition here, and that's the subsidy definition. When I'm talking about Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture subsidy programs, these can be any of about 60 programs that are administered by the USDA. And what I'm really going to get back to was the not so distant past where we saw a dramatic spike in the cost of eggs. In some parts of the country, we saw it go up to as much as $10 a dozen. And at the time, in 2023 and 2024, a lot of the blame was being placed on an avian flu where the government mandated that many of these chicken farms and egg farms, egg producers, had to kill off large portions of their flock due to this avian flu. Well, it turns out that some of the evidence we're starting to see is that large corporate egg producers were maintaining their production levels while sharply increasing profits at the same time as increasing costs with smaller producers. And they were also using this excuse to ask for federal taxpayer-funded support. This kind of double dipping is the thing that we really need to have politicians looking at. And in investigating this even further, I came across a second article that I think ties right into this and shows you some of the concerns that we should have as taxpayers who fund these type of programs. Forbes had a article that was titled "Mapping the U.S. Farm Subsidy $1 Million Club." To take this through our history, the whole idea of USDA supplemented subsidy programs for farms goes all the way back to the Great Depression. And it was to ensure that our country had a consistent food supply. It had a stable food market where people weren't exorbitantly increasing the prices of fresh produce because of limited supply. But what this has really turned into is now wealthy investors and large corporate farm operations being the recipients of these government subsidies. And when you look at the top 10 farm subsidy recipients, this article was from about 5 years ago, and each of these recipients was getting grants that were averaging about $1.8 million a year, some of them since 2008 all the way until 2020, 2021. And these are not the small local farmers who need this type of, or who rely on this type of subsidy. These are often people who are purchasing large tracts of land and farms as tax write-offs and using this as something to protect wealth, and it's shown by a couple of examples that I'm going to give you right now that are subsidy recipients of these USDA programs. Now, I have my intern Anthony here. Are you a basketball fan in addition to being a baseball fan?
No, but my brother's very big into basketball,
Okay.
Unfortunately.
So Glenn Taylor is the owner of the Minnesota Timberwolves. This guy is, I want to say, like number 350 out of 400 on the Forbes 400 wealthiest people in the country. He owns an egg and dairy farm in Iowa that received subsidies just in 2018 of $116,502. Why does someone this wealthy need taxpayer-funded subsidies to run a farm? These type of things need to really be looked at and say, what type of programs are we supporting here? Are we really doing the right thing? To further go into this, I was able to find that between 2015 and 2017, some of these same subsidized programs, of these 60 programs administered by the USDA, $626 million were given to recipients in urban areas with more than 250,000 residents and virtually no farms. In fact, $18 million of these programs went to Chicago, Houston, New York City, LA, and Philadelphia. I agree that those cities tend to be fresh produce deserts. They rely on all fresh produce coming from dozens, if not hundreds of miles away. But are we benefiting I'm going to say, are we benefiting these cities by providing subsidies where they are not going to be able to produce these necessary local fresh produce? I wish that cities took on more of a role in this and had things like rooftop gardens. I think that's actually probably a better use than a lot of the solar that we have that are on top of these buildings. Other countries have done this. I think it's time for us to look at alternatives here where there are concerns about fresh produce getting into areas, but we need to look at how this money is efficiently being spent, and is it going to the right places where the best value is being afforded to our taxpayer dollar. A couple other things that I want to do as we're getting to within the last 5 minutes of our first segment here is to follow up on an update of the Eversource discussion that we have had numerous times on previous episodes here. And I'm going to reference a letter that came out, I believe it was March 27th. And this was from the Eversource Deputy General Counsel. His name is Duncan McKay. And it was a letter that was sent to DEEP and legislative leaders saying that Eversource was going to decline to enter into a power purchase agreement with 3 large solar projects that were being planned in Connecticut. These 3 sites would produce about 54 megawatts of solar power. And the reason that they cited Eversource declining this invitation to be a part of this is because it would not only be a program or a project that was significantly overpriced, and in previous episodes I've talked about power purchase agreements that a utility company enters into, and that some of these renewable energy sources like solar and wind are being sold at 300% or more the current distribution rate. And when you look at not only these power purchase agreements being vastly overpriced, but also then being a pass-through tax onto ratepayers that is going to significantly increase the public benefits charge. And in fact, these 3 solar power agreements would have cost approximately $238 million over the next 20 years to ratepayers. It was also described in this letter that if the state of Connecticut does not have comprehensive energy strategies moving forward that take into consideration ratepayer increases and address that Eversource is not going to be able to be a part of these programs. It goes back to things that I've said in many previous episodes about this layering of energy policy, one on top of another through multiple legislative cycles, that has really caused the most dramatic increase in our electrical costs. Unfortunately, Connecticut also sits surrounded by states that will not allow us to increase any type of natural gas usage for electrical production in Connecticut, because it would have to come through either New York or Massachusetts. And we know that both of those are circumstances that we have kind of been opted out of. So it really shows that there's a concern for increase in our public benefits charges if we don't have some sort of control set in place to make sure that our electrical costs are very clearly in the favor of ratepayers moving forward. We're about 2 minutes from the end of our segment here, and we'll be talking in the second segment about a couple of other updates that I have from previous episodes that we've discussed. And then we're going to get into a couple of very interesting topics that have happened in the past week, not just at the state level, but on the national level also. So be sure that you tune back in a couple of minutes after we take care of some business here with WILI 95.3 FM. This is Right Now, and we'll be back for our second segment in just about 4 minutes. Welcome back to our second segment of Right Now with Chris Reddy here on 95.3 FM WILI. In the first segment, we talked about some of the updates of previous episodes with some news that has recently come about, and I'm going to continue that right now with a topic that I spent some time earlier in the year on, and at the end of 2025 when there was an emergency certification in the state legislature that had to do with housing. In the past 6 months since the original housing bill, and now as we're going through this 2026 legislative session, and there are amendments to that housing bill, there has been a surge in lawsuits across Connecticut as local planning and zoning are trying to prevent development of affordable housing in certain areas of their town as out-of-state developers are coming in and assessing where they can fit in these type of housing structures they want. But within the past few months, this has been popping up all along the coast of Connecticut. Towns like Greenwich, Shelton, East Lyme, New Canaan, Fairfield, Stonington, Stratford. Some of the cities and towns in the inner portion of Connecticut, such as Newtown, Bethel, Glastonbury, Simsbury, West Hartford, Rocky Hill, are facing some of these same situations. And if you tuned into previous episodes of Right Now, you've heard me talk about the housing bill and how one of the concerns in losing local control over planning and zoning, and this idea that Connecticut has had for a long time of home rule, where local ordinances supersede state unless there's a specific reason why they shouldn't. We're seeing that taken away. And in fact, one of the things that has happened with this housing bill is that when planning and zoning tries to oppose any type of this development, unless it is for a specific safety reason, public safety reason, when it goes to court and the town loses, this is something that is going to end up costing taxpayers, because developers will be able to recoup the litigation costs that it takes to fight any type of this prevention of development. I've highlighted a few things around Connecticut about some of these developments. In fact, one of them not far from where we are in our studio right now, just north of us in Mansfield, where the affordable workforce, as they're described, housing in a specific apartment complex, they're finding that they're unable to rent them, and over 80% of them remain vacant as they're having trouble finding someone who fits that specific need for that type of housing at that cost. Now, there are some other things, and again, I want to bring up some of these examples because these are things that really should have been seen as these bills are being developed. And one of them is something that I was just made aware of recently in a town that I'm familiar with quite a bit because I grew up in the area, the town of Bethel down in Fairfield County right near Danbury. There is a homeowner that has a detached structure on their 1.2 acre lot. When I looked at it, it looks like it could possibly have been a garage of some sort at one point, but there is a primary residence on the 1.2 acre lot. This is a secondary structure that does have a second story on it, and this homeowner is now on a 1.2 acre lot looking to renovate this into 3 one-bedroom apartments. And again, we're really, with this bill, regulating density and increasing density of housing rather than really addressing affordability, which is a problem because it's a market issue. And that brings me to another example that someone sent to me just within the past about week and a half. And this is as they were driving through Old Lyme, and it was a new development, and it was a placard, a billboard, that advertised 12 lots in this subdivision as being available, and that the price of the lots started at $1.125 million for an unimproved lot. How that addresses affordable housing and how those are the only lots that are available for development really shows that there is a disconnect between what is actually happening with the affordability crisis in Connecticut and legislation that they're trying to pass. One of the things that I've said over and over again is that the issues with housing come specifically because of affordability. And when you are further encouraging people who are, for instance, owners of only 1 or 2 multifamily properties, not large corporations that own, vast amounts of apartments and complexes around Connecticut. But when you restrict the ability for these people to conduct business, when you change eviction laws, which is one of the other bills that's being raised right now in housing and, is going to be passed in this legislative cycle, it really discouraged these people from continuing in the business. When you have no reason where a private contract between a property owner and a tenant now has to have the state involved, and the state saying, well, you can't tell someone at the end of a lease that you've decided that the lease is going to be terminated, and allow that person to stay in there indefinitely. You're discouraging people from becoming owner occupants of these properties. So there are a lot of things that are really concerning about the way that housing is being addressed right now in Connecticut. And this is where we're starting to see some of these results. You're starting to see these type of lawsuits coming up that are really going to put taxpayers in small rural towns in jeopardy. And these are things that really need to be looked at as to whether or not we are truly addressing the root causes of why they say that there is a housing shortage of anywhere from, I've heard, as low as 60 and as high as 120,000 units in Connecticut. So we'll continue to talk about this, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody is aware that there are some things that are being discussed right now at the legislative level to be aware of and to keep an eye on. To talk about some of the other topics that we're going to discuss here as we're finishing up our hour-long episode today on April 23rd, one of the things that I kind of found interesting as more of a national level issue and topic that really was not getting a whole lot of press is a grand jury indictment that was handed down on Tuesday, and this happened in Alabama because it is the headquarters of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And the Southern Poverty Law Center was founded in Alabama by a lawyer by the name of Morris Dees in 1971. And it was a law practice that offered pro bono representation for either people that were very poor or otherwise disenfranchised dealing with civil rights and racism issues. For a long time, I've read some of the cases that they have litigated and great work that was being done. What this indictment is claiming is that over the past few years, donor funding, because it's a nonprofit that relies on private donations, was that there was fraud that was occurring. And the way that the Southern Poverty Law Center was defrauding these donors is that they weren't being clear on how some of these donated funds were being used. And what this grand jury indictment claims is that there were at least 11 counts of the civil rights group using donor money to fund the very same extremist groups that they were claiming to fight. And you can go online and see this. It's now becoming, as the indictment is being released and you're seeing some of this, some of these are absolutely horrible organizations. And what the Southern Poverty Law Center was claiming is that they were providing funds to informants, and that these informants were providing them with information, which even in their statement, they said that they often referred to law enforcement agencies. I have several really big concerns about this because first, they weren't being clear about how money was being spent. But also, when you look at some of the claims that are in this indictment, some of these organizations that were extremely racist organizations, the funds were being provided, and those funds directly went to these organizations, some of their leaders, and in some cases, the money that was being paid to the informants was for them to do things such as steal documents from the organizations. And while I don't have a problem with these type of organizations being investigated as to what they're doing, I don't think that a nonprofit organization should be taking on the role of being the supplier for undercover agents and undercover operatives operating outside of a judicial system. You're not the FBI. You're not a law enforcement agency. I respect the work that they do fighting for civil rights and for people that are disenfranchised. But this really is starting to look almost like the fireman who starts the fire so that they can then run to put it out and be calling themselves a hero. And that's where it really concerns me. And I've said this on multiple episodes before, where the way that nonprofits do this is by using shell organizations, other nonprofits, non-governmental organizations, where money is passed through from one organization to another, and then there's virtually no control over where this money goes, the ability to audit and see how the money is spent. And that's what we're dealing with right now. Now, what the supporters of the SPLC are going to say is that they're doing this work trying to go undercover and disrupt these operations. When you are being accused of $3 million of support over a short number of years, and these large amounts of money flowing directly into some of these organizations that you are then trying to eradicate, it really questions whether you are being very clear about what the objectives are of this nonprofit organization. So these are the things that I want people to be very careful of and clear of as we hear these type of stories coming out. This is something the Department of Justice did look into, provided a grand jury indictment for, and now we're going to see what happens over the next few weeks to months as this continues to unravel. One of the other things that I wanted to bring up, and this will pretty much bring us to the end of our second segment here in our April 23rd episode of Right Now, was an executive order that was signed at the White House on Saturday. And this was something that really, again, was kind of missed by the media. And it was something that I had heard a little bit about previously, but then in the past week, I've really been kind of looking into some of the details regarding this and doing a little bit more of an investigation into what actually happened here, because this is something that, as a career first responder and paramedic, and having seen the effects of being in this profession and having friends and people that I work with who have suffered from things like PTSD, and also for veterans that I've known and people that I've cared for who have suffered from traumatic brain injuries as they've been deployed as part of their military experience. What happened on Saturday was that there was an executive order that was signed that changed the classification of a medication that's called Ibogaine. Ibogaine had previously been classified a Schedule 1 pharmaceutical, which meant that there was really no ability for there to be any type of research done. It was very limited. Funding available for research into this medication was extremely limited. The availability of this medication within the United States in order to perform clinical research was extremely limited. But this is not something that is new. Ibogaine actually is a derivative, and its true pharmaceutical name is ibogaine hydrochloride, but it is a derivative of the bark of a root from a shrub from Central and West Africa. And in fact, this plant is called Tabernanthe iboga. And for literally more than 1,000 years, some of these tribes, and specifically the Bwiti religion, which is Bwiti, normally this is practiced in the areas around Gabon and Cameroon and the Republic of Congo. This shrub that is very common, they use the root bark in not only spiritual and ceremonial practices for thousands of years, but also this is something that was recognized as early as the early 1900s, and specifically in France, this pharmaceutical was advertised and sold, like marketed, under the guise of a antidepressant and something that could help treat addictions. Now, what's unusual about this is that, and the reason why it has this class 1 schedule is because it is a extremely potent psychoactive hallucinogen. And not only does it have these psychoactive hallucinogenic properties, but with this class of medications, that kind of street term, the trip that's associated with this can be very prolonged. In fact, it can be 24 to 48 hours, and there can be residual effects for another 72 hours beyond that. But some of the initial clinical trials associated with this medication are extremely promising, not only from the standpoint of treating PTSD and traumatic brain injury, but also its efficiency in treating severe bipolar depression, severe anxiety, treating not only opioid, but also cocaine and alcohol addiction. And in fact, some of these studies, some of the ones that have been available in the United States, were limited to 12-month studies. That's as far as they could extend following these clinical trials, and they showed magnificent results even as far out as 12 months in treating these. So I'm going to take a couple minutes and talk specifically about how this really works and some of the background behind it so people can understand what was actually done on Saturday. There's very little that is known about the substance and the way that the body metabolizes ibogaine and how it really directly affects the brain. But initial studies are showing that the neurotransmitters that connect nerve ending to nerve ending in the brain are stimulated by a number of these chemical neurotransmitters. Some of them you've heard of: serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine. Not only is this substance, ibogaine, capable of stimulating the release of these, but one of the big issues with traumatic brain injuries and those concussive syndromes where people have been blown up, struck in the head a number of times, with all of these severe disabilities that come about from traumatic brain injury, one of the concerns is the neuroplasticity, and that's the ability for the brain to start to recover. And in fact, some of the early clinical trials are showing that there is an increase in this neuroplasticity when there is even just one single dose of this ibogaine taken by someone who is suffering. And I'm going to describe to you one of the, I'm going to say it was a clinical accounts by someone, and I'll preface this by saying who was present when this executive order was signed. Some of the biggest supporters of this treatment for not only PTSD but TBI, which is a huge concern among veterans and people who were recently active military that have had these type of concussive brain injuries. There were several very recognizable special forces people that were in the White House when this was signed. There was Marcus Luttrell, If you remember, he was the Special Forces operator who had the movie and the book Lone Survivor written about him. His brother, his twin brother, who's also Special Forces, was there. Robert O'Neill, who was the Special Forces operator who was the one in the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound. He was there supporting this. In fact, these Special Forces operators said that they had gone through this treatment to deal with some of the things that they were suffering. And one of the cases that I read about specifically was another Special Forces operator who was profoundly, and his level of disability was rated at moderate to severe disability from traumatic brain injury. And what really made him look for an alternative treatment was that he was unable to function. He could not hold down a job. He was struggling with his family life. One morning, he woke up, could not remember his wife's name, his spouse's name. They thought that he was having a stroke. And in fact, when they brought him to the hospital, the physicians told him, no, this is just something that you're going to have to deal with. It's part of his traumatic brain injury. Right now, these ibogaine treatments are only licensed or only allowed in a few countries, among them Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, New Zealand, South Africa. He went to Mexico. I think that the number they said was it cost about $15,000 for this single treatment. But his level of disability at 30 days post-treatment was from moderate to severe disability to virtually no disability. He went from a score, I think that was about 23.5 to a 3 on the federal government and the Department of Veteran Affairs disability scale, to where now he has a job and he is a strong advocate for this type of treatment. They've seen similar results not only with traumatic brain injury, but also, as I described earlier, with addiction. And the way that this does it is that part of the process of metabolism in the body is that it disrupts the addictive pathways in the brain. And not only does it disrupt those pathways from the impulse to continue with the substance abuse, but it in fact erases most of the horrible withdrawals that are associated with not only opioid but also alcohol addiction, and the withdrawals that can be life-threatening within those first 48 to 72 hours. Now, there are some issues. There are some significant issues with these treatments, and this is what really has kind of prevented a whole lot of real clinical trials in the United States. Because one of the things that's very interesting about this medication also is that not only does it have these profound effects on the brain, but it also has a significant effect on the heart. Again, I taught paramedic classes for years, taught people to read EKGs and how the electrical pathways in the heart work. But one of the things that happens here is that there's a portion of the cardiac cycle of your heart muscle every time your heart beats. That's an involuntary function that's caused by an intrinsic pacemaker in your heart. That's what stimulates your heart beating 60, 80, 100 times a minute. There's a certain portion of that cardiac cycle where another heartbeat cannot occur because the electrolytes that cause the muscle impulse, like the muscle cell fibers to contract, those electrical impulses need to go back to their normal cycle. It's called the sodium-potassium pump. I'm not going to go into details about it, but those electrolytes need to become from one side of the cell membrane to the other side of the cell membrane very quickly. If this happens at the wrong moment, and because this medication causes a prolonged interval of that moment, there's a possibility that these electrical impulses can start when the heart isn't capable of contracting again and can send the person into a lethal arrhythmia. So you literally have to have a defibrillator on standby for the entire duration of this person's, time being treated with ibogaine. So it's not just simply monitoring the person after they've ingested it. It is actually having people who can stand by ready to perform this type of cardiac resuscitation that could be necessary as a side effect from this medication. I'll talk about this a little bit more in another future episode because clearly this is something that we're going to be looking at as a prospective way to combat something that is a huge health cost, not only in the United States, but across the world. When you look at the incidence of behavioral health emergencies, behavioral health crises, addiction, and the cost that it is to us as a society, this is something that I actually support strongly and see this as an opportunity for people to have some relief from some of these problems that they're suffering. So we're going to continue to talk about this again in future episodes. This has been Right Now here on WILI 95.3M for our April 23rd episode. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next Thursday.